Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to Unlocking SAP Value After Selecting Your System Integrator, Essential Strategies for Success. I'm Heather Lima, and I'm a content producer here at ASUG. Today's webcast will be recorded. You will receive the post-event email tomorrow with the link to the on-demand webcast, along with a link to our survey. If you feel this webcast is valuable, go ahead and pass the link on to your colleagues. And also, please take that 2-question survey because we like to know what you think. If you have any questions, go ahead and enter them in that Q&A box. Any questions we don't get to on the webcast, we'll answer offline. Now, I'll hand off our webcast to our host, Todd Durischer with KPMG. Todd, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Todd DeRocher, and it's my pleasure to lead this session on unlocking SAP value after selecting your system integrator. With 25 years of experience in leading large transformations globally and currently heading KPMG's Energy and Natural Resources US SAP go-to-market and delivery, I've seen an immense potential that well-executed SAP programs can deliver. Today, I'm going to focus on strategies and actions to ensure the success after selecting the SI. I'll start by walking through a typical ERP journey, identifying when SI selections occur most often. I'll then discuss 3 areas that often undermine large programs and the actions that you can take to turn these gaps into opportunities. I'll conclude by bringing these to life with illustrative and relevant case studies. As we journey through this discussion, please remember that the goal is not only to implement SAP successfully, but to ensure that your investment delivers business value well into the future. Thank you for your attention today, and let's unlock the full potential of your SAP investment. So I think it's important to start with the journey and the roadmap that clients go through. Unlike smaller investments in technology programs where the program often starts about 6 months before you engage an SI or partners, SAP tends to be a much more invasive program, touching technology throughout your company and impacting every user. So today, when we think about that journey, we look at it, and our view is that it starts about 2 to 3 years before the actual start of the program. During that time, our clients are going through and they're looking at things like, are we going to go single source and just do SAP? Are we going to use other products? What business functions are we going to do? What order and what way do we want to implement this? And during that time, you often see a lot of heavy engagement at the conferences, lots of meetings and workshops with vendors and potential vendors. They then go into this period that we see usually within about a year of the starting the program. That program we call the hyper-education part of the project. This is where the education side of this ticks up. You see where often at the conferences, instead of saying 3, 4, 5 people there, we see 20, 25 people joining. We see lots of meetings. We see lots of discussions with the executives, with the board. And this ultimately leads to the list of questions and the discussion of the areas that they need to decide and what to do with the program itself. And that's when we see this foundation building period occur. Sometimes it's called phase 0. We like to call it the foundation. And that's the point at which you're answering and you're locking in things like what's the scope, who's going to lead the program, how are we going to partner, is it one or many, what technologies will we be using, and what order, what business processes, and what capabilities do we think are the priority versus those that are more of the foundation. And then even questions of, are we going to truly transform our business, or are we just going to adopt and upgrade the technology? This then leads to the RFP process, which typically we see that this is an RFP process for the major SI or system implementer, integrator, whichever your choice is, that we see that this is the time when they're selected and brought in. Sometimes firms and companies will use a separate partner to do global design or enterprise design, but usually it's the system integrator. And then from there, they go to the implementation and they go through deployment. The critical part of this is to really understand that the project itself which typically clients look at it as from the RFP forward, has many years before it of prep. We see some clients spending, 2 to 3 years. We see others spending 5 or 6, because most of our clients are not looking at this as we have to do it, let's just get going, we're anxious to start. Most understand the complexity and want to spend that time doing the upfront work to be prepared to move forward. So when you think about how do you build the foundation, well, what we see is the SI selection tends to be the thing that dominates a lot of the discussion up through foundation building. Who's it going to be? How big is it going to be? What are we going to have them do? Who should it be? All of those questions. But what often happens is that when the program is in the earlier stages, the project team's smaller, the spend is lower. But once you select the SI, you sign the contract and you onboard them, the spend goes up significantly. So does the pace of the program. And it is not uncommon for the board or the executives to start their questioning about a week after the SI selection that starts and ends with, how quickly are we going to be done? The problem with that is before you get off to the races and you get on the bullet train to get the technology implemented, we think there are 3 areas that are often overlooked. And those 3 areas can undermine the success of the program. The first of this is defining the program culture and how the teaming is going to work. A lot of clients and a lot of system implementers and partners think that the culture will figure itself out, that the way we work, we'll work together fine, we will all team, everyone will leave their badge at the door. Problem is we found that if this isn't a deliberate effort to set up and figure out what are the priorities of the program, how do we align, how do we think through that, and how are we going to team, things like co-location, things like who's going to lead, who's in charge, who's not, how does that hierarchy work? But also, are we going to be consensus driven? Are we going to empower people to make decisions? If you don't do that up front and you don't spend meaningful time building the team, throughout the program, you'll get bogged down with how you're making decisions. You'll get bogged down by teams not working together or having different objectives. A big part of this is setting your objectives for the end of the program. Things like what are we going to share? What are we going to believe in? And what's the brand and the value we're delivering? Because if people don't understand the mission and they don't understand the true value and they're not bought in at the end or throughout the journey, then it gets really hard to mobilize and get through those tough parts of the program. The second area is really around strategic governance and decision frameworks. We look at this and everyone says, well, we have a way to manage the program. We have a scope plan, we have a schedule management plan, we have a way to manage risk and issues. What we look at here is more of, but how are we going to make decisions as a team? So if you have back to culture, a typical culture of consensus-driven decision-making, or where people don't feel they're empowered to make decisions, then it can slow down the program when it comes to, hey, we were looking at a design, we have 3 options, which one are we going to choose? And because of that, the program itself will get fatigued and slow down. You'll get into emotional decision-making. You won't really understand what the objectives are. So by setting time right then and saying, now that we've secured our partners, now that we have our plans, now that we have our budgets, let's go back and think about clearly defining the value we're delivering. And from there, how are we going to govern to value? How are we going to make decisions? And how are we going to empower the teams to make those decisions throughout their day-to-day? These programs have hundreds of people working, lots of work streams, lots of work going on in parallel. What you can't have is a view that decision-making can only be made by a select few that have to be in every meeting. You have to find a way to give people the framework and the ability to make those decisions. You also have to think about the decisions in terms of business value, outcome, and so forth. Reason that's important is because typically on smaller projects, you can make decisions on scope, schedule, risk, quality. So things like, hey, we have a change request coming in from the business, they'd like to do X. Typical scenarios, the first question is, what's the value? Or more likely, what's it going to cost us? And do we have budget? The difference with coming up with a business framework is thinking about things in terms of what is their business value? Are they differentiating to us as a company? Do they change and really make a difference in how we go to market, how we sell our product, how we sell our service, or the cost structure involved in that? Or do they impact our people's lives? In the middle of that type of a typical decision framework are things like, is it regulatory? Do we need to do it? And is it different because of that? And at the bottom of that pyramid, which is the biggest section, is you find about 80% of decisions are really around foundational elements. And by setting up a framework that says, for example, that for foundational or that 80% at the bottom, we're going to make decisions based on cost and on standardization and simplification. In the middle, we're going to try to standardize and simplify, but we understand that there may be regulatory or other reasons that we have to do it differently. But we're going to try to minimize cost, and we're going to try to do it as efficiently as possible. And then at the top of that decision framework, in the areas that are most related to those things that are competitively differentiating for you, those are the areas where you want to budget extra time to think through, where you may have to customize, you may not, but the way you leverage it, whether it's the data, the technology, or how you do it, make a meaningful difference in the value you can deliver out of the program. But by understanding capabilities and processes and technology in those terms, when change requests come in, when decisions need to be made, you can come back and rely on an objective framework to make those versus more the emotional frameworks that most of us are used to of this is the way I've always done it, this is how I do it, this is how I want to do it. The third area is really implementing early a value-based quality assurance program. We emphasize value because typical quality assurance programs tended to come out of the SOX days where we were looking at things from, are we doing our project controls correctly? Are we documenting decisions? Are we following risks and issues? Are we managing costs? Each of those is critical as to whether you're able to stay on scope, on budget, and to deliver the product. The problem with those frameworks is they often ignore value and don't think about decisions that are made to increase the value or to preserve value as you go through the program and you learn more. So thinking about project management, quality assurance throughout the program in a way that's more inclusive of the business designs, the tech designs, the outcomes, and where they're tracking and making sure you're not getting value leakage throughout the program is critical to the overall success. You all have seen many programs where the company went live, the project was successful, air quotes, and they delivered the software as needed. But with most programs of this magnitude, the next question is, did we get the value? And that's often not as easy as to answer as it is to whether you went live on time. Often, and we hear this a lot lately with the programs that have gone live with SAP S4, where the clients are saying, all right, we're live. We've spent this huge investment on a leading technology and set of platforms, but we're not sure we see the value. Sure, they see the technical value and they can see the ability to be on leading software, but they don't see the business value in whether they have changed the way they deliver their services, whether they have increased or improved the value to the market, or any of the other outcomes that they talked about. So we find that these three areas, and I'll go into some specific actions in the next slide, but we find that these three areas are often overlooked, or once you get going, there's so much pressure to get into design, to get into build, and to get it tested and deployed, that these things become secondary. And these are the things that often, when you look at a program that doesn't achieve value or doesn't deliver, you can often, if not almost always, go back to these things versus, was it the technology that failed or did we not understand our business? Usually those are fine. It's more the program culture, how we governed, and whether or not we were consciously watching value from the beginning. So on this slide, next thing is, okay, so that sounds great, but how do we actually do it? And so what we find, and this is a very basic view of it, and you can imagine this can get much more complex, is that we look at program culture and teaming. You've onboarded the SI, you've onboarded your partners, and you're ready to go. Rather than jumping right into, well, do we have our schedule? Does everybody have something to do? Do we have our workshop schedule? Is take some time And this is time well spent and is often not one day, but can take a couple of weeks, which is what are the program values and objectives that we as a team want to achieve? In other words, how do we align on our objectives so that we are all going in the same direction and trying to achieve the same thing? This is sometime at odds with the contracts, but now's a good time to fix or to address those issues so that you can achieve the results and the outcomes. The second is team building. And I find it funny that when we build teams and we get them together, you'll find different groups are doing team building activities. But are we getting together and saying, rather than just let's go out and get dinner or drinks, thinking about ways to get the teams excited to work together, to get them to know each other personally, and in a post-COVID world, getting them to locate together at times so that they can work together, solve problems together, and really focus again on fixing or addressing any issues that come up in a way that friends do or that colleagues do. And then the last part of this is really around stakeholder engagement. So thinking about your stakeholders, thinking about the executives, because often the stakeholders and executives can influence the culture of the program positively or negatively. If you have an executive that keeps telling their team on the ground that this isn't our priority or tells them that our priority is different than the program, then that undermines the program. So this is the time when meeting with executives, making sure you're aligned and that the program's delivering the value that they need to achieve their goals is critical. Because then you're aligned, you're marching in the same direction, your team feels supported in their home areas as well as they do on the program. So what are the outcomes of this? What we've found is that teams that do this up front and that do it often throughout the program find that the team is much more motivated, that leads work together, that rather than setting up meetings to discuss issues, they stop by the desk and just talk about it, right? It's kind of funny how this is what I would call old school, but it's the reality that when we had these large programs and everyone located together, most of the problem solving and the issues and the defining solutions was done by the team together, going by each other's desks and working together. Now when we went through COVID and people started working remotely, everything required a 15-minute or 1-hour meeting to even answer the basic questions. The other part is that people understand the vision and they get bought into it, right? If you have an impassioned set of leaders, people get excited. They want to do it and they want to achieve that goal, and they tend to work harder and longer and share the value and even the success of it. And then it also improves communication. We all know that we've been on projects where the number one issue is nobody's communicating with one another, or it's ineffective, or it tends to be very negative. By doing this successfully out of the gate and building those personal connections, this really helps that the team knows how to communicate with one another. They are building trust with one another, and that yields much, much better results. So what do you get from this? Well, you get a cohesive team, much smoother adoption of changes, and enhanced project success. And really, I will tell you this one, there's a term a colleague uses, that program culture is undefeated, and it is true. If you have a bad program culture and you have not set it up correctly and don't care and feed it, it is the number one reason programs fail. We can all cite the cases where it was, a schedule issue or a scope issue or this issue or that. I can tell you if you really understood the problem, it's more likely that the team wasn't a team and it was a bad culture. So the second area is strategic governance and decision frameworks. In this area, we find it important that once you bring on the partners, it's time to step back and say, so let's go back through how governance is going to work. Now that we're a team with many different ways of doing things, different schedule management processes, different business and technical decision frameworks, we need to get everyone together. The contracts are dry. We can move past that, where we are now one team, and we need to make sure that we have ways of working and decision-making processes to help us to govern the program. So by setting those up and thinking about them, not in terms of rigid, where we're so rigid with our design that it's everyone must do it the exact same way, but adapting and saying, hey, we're bringing in partners that have fantastic models of their own. how do we leverage those models? How do we incorporate them? And how do we build that framework? How do we also balance long-term decision making with short-term? There's often times where we're making very short decisions on, hey, we've got to get into testing, we've got to get the designs done, just make the decision. But that may not be the best for long-term. On the other hand, we can't always be thinking about long-term and not hit our objectives and our timelines. So how are we going to balance that? When are we going to escalate? And how are we going to leverage operating committees, decision boards, steering committees, and other groups that are there to help? And then how are we going to make sure we're reviewing these plans? And how are we going to do this on a regular basis where we're not getting tunnel vision into the areas we're looking at today, but long-term? And I think I mentioned on the prior slide, this is also the time to come up with how will we make business and technical decisions? Who are the decision makers? How are they empowered to make decisions? What are the factors that are part of those decisions? And what are the objective way they can make those decisions? The outcomes of this obviously are streamlined decision-making processes. We find that the programs run smoother. There's less emotion in the decisions. Governance is transparent. People combine this with the one above. People are willing to speak out when they see something that's a risk, or when they see an issue. By building a strong culture and putting in the right governance, you're empowering the team to actually get the work done and to use and leverage each other to get there. This reduces overall program risk, it improves consistency of oversight, and it really results in a higher quality implementation. In this program, and most programs that leverage this and take the time to do this right, they also see that they're much more aligned to achieving value than just achieving cost, scope, schedule. Now, we all know, anybody who has a PMP or is a program manager knows that you need to focus on cost, scope, and schedule. But we need to do that by delivering the value, and we can't do it in spite of the value. So the last part in this slide is really value-based program quality assurance. I mentioned on the earlier slide that value is at the heart of this, and there's many ways to engage with a quality assurance program. This can be done internally by internal audit or by a business team. It can be done externally. It can be done in a way that it's where people are embedded on the program throughout, where it's quarterly check-ins, where it's milestone-based. So many ways to do this. But what we find lacking in a lot of quality assurance programs is it's thought of as, hey, when we get done with design, we'll engage for the first time. Or when we get our program set up, we'll have a program management review and that'll be it. We find that embedding it throughout the life cycle of the program is critical. That way, the team is not just looking at deliverables and telling you things after the fact that could have helped you, but now it's just too late. But they're part of the team. They can see how the team's interacting. They can see the discussions, the tones. Often the paperwork can look great, but you realize that people aren't actually communicating. They're doing it through JIRA tickets or other things. So establishing a quality assurance program throughout the life cycle is critical. It also means that they're able to see things coming because they understand where you're headed, and they can tell if, objectively, does this seem like we're on the right path, or are there other things that could get in the way? This is a great place to leverage AI. AI can be used both after the program and what you're delivering, but it can also be used in ways to look at how you're monitoring the program. And for example, we're seeing lately on a lot of our programs where we're able to take the knowledge that's being generated, the design documents, the schedules, the scoping documents, the risks and rate logs. And by leveraging AI, it's finding patterns that aren't obvious. And so those patterns can be translated into potential risks and issues that the program may not be aware of at this point. Very efficient, very quick, but it does give you a perspective that sometimes is broader than the team without the team having to spend nights, weekends trying to figure things out. Focus, the value-based program should be focused not only on immediate execution, but how that's going to impact long-term value. So the program may choose to cut scope because it's not going to be delivered on time, and it's going to impact the overall scheduled due date. And if you're one of the large programs where clients are spending $1 million a day or a week, then delays cost significant money. And so oftentimes leadership are making decisions without fully appreciating the long-term value and the impact. It goes both ways too, though, because when you look at the overall value, if you've seen some leakage and you realize you're not attaining it anyways, sometimes the quicker decision is the right one. And then conducting regular assessments and reviews, and really thinking of this as an objective. And I say objective versus independent because objective allows this team to provide recommendations versus having to stay back and just point to issues. So what do you get for this? You get high quality deliverables, you get a much more efficient program, you know, and you have reporting based on the value you're achieving. And so you're able to see these things throughout the program, and you're able to realize and manage the value. And so we look at these, and these are critical in, quote unquote, future proofing the implementation. But really what that means is that when you go live and have success, that you also have business success, and you're able to get the true value out of this. And I say value a lot because for us, outcome and value are why you're doing these programs. And another part that often is missed in program quality assurance is, are we actually monitoring change management culture and looking at is the adoption there, and are people going to be able to use this to achieve their jobs and do things better in the future? So to bring all of this to life, we really want to look at some relevant case studies. And in these case studies, I've simplified, I've merged some stuff together to make them more illustrative. But each of these is real and things that I see every day. The first is an example of a company I worked for. And when we joined them and were working with them, we realized that we couldn't understand why things weren't moving faster. And it really came to a head when we went into an executive meeting after months of doing the program, where the executive at the meeting asked the very basic question of, I still don't understand why you're doing this and why we have to do this now. And I'm sure that's not the only time. It's not the only time I've heard it. I'm sure it's not the only time you all have heard it. And the reason for that typically goes to, we never got full buy-in. We didn't align to their objectives. And we didn't really understand what drove them. And we weren't loud enough with the messaging. It wasn't valuable enough to them to actually listen. In addition, we then saw in the same program that employees were very reluctant to commit to the program. They didn't want to join. They didn't want to commit to being there full time. And they didn't want to change their career path to be on the project. And then you had the vendors joining with lots of different cultures and views. And so this program got off to a really rocky start, where everybody's trying to prove themselves. Everyone's trying to bring the deck or the slides that are going to tell the story. But what we didn't do was step back and say, what is our mission as a team? Not what's your mission, what's the other person's mission, what's the client mission? What is our mission? And as any good mission, we need to know what the end objectives are. We need to understand the value it creates. We need to understand the what's in it for me. And then we need to cascade that down through the program. And often that comes in the form in what we did here, which is creating a unified program vision, a brand for the program. Like, instead of just calling it the S4 program or the SAP program or the ERP program, let's really think about what we are doing here. And you see that in programs called Polaris. You see that in programs that are called Next Gen ERP, Next Gen, as well as others. Magellan is another common name. And you have to decide, are we focused on the program being about the journey and what we learn, or the program about the outcome? So I mentioned on this one and earlier that you should conduct, team building exercises. You should be thinking about how to align leadership. And we actually did some offsites with the leadership in this case to bring them together and help them see the value in what was delivered, but also to help them appreciate why we needed, great talent from their teams, and why we needed to create career paths for those folks so that when they joined the program, they would become future leaders of the company. And so that helped with the objectives of the team so that they saw the value and why they should be involved. And ultimately, this created a much more cohesive, motivated team. The executives had their cue cards so that they knew why this program was going on, and we didn't have to keep rationalizing it every time we met. And ultimately, this program is, and there's a couple that are like this, but they're all off to very good, I don't want to say starts because they're about midway through, but they're working well. The teams are working well together. And the executives aren't constantly asking these teams, why are we doing this? Should we stop? Should we reconsider? Should we cut the budget? The second case is really around decision making. We had a client and they actually had the thought. So they brought us in and we were working with them in the foundation building. And they had approached us to say, we need the right business decision framework. We need to focus on what differentiates us as a company. We need to focus on value. And we need to really standardize and simplify what we do as a global corporation. And the way to simplify that is we need everyone to understand, every employee, every executive, that about 80% of what we do is foundational. There is no strategic benefit in doing it differently than the software. And the only time we need to change that is when there are regulatory or global or country specific issues. And then they looked at it and said, we want to take about 20% of our capabilities or our areas, and we want to focus those in because they're differentiating to us. That's where we make money. That's where we improve our customer satisfaction. That is where our stock price goes up and so forth. We took that a few steps further and got it down to the point where that decision framework focused on things like in the differentiating areas. Is it the technology that differentiates? The data? Is it a specific part of the process? What is it that differentiates us? So that during the design process, you could focus very specifically on that and spend extra time and didn't rush it. In contrast, the things that were foundational were very much of we're using SAP the way SAP is intended. We're going to remove all customizations in the prior version. We're going to remove all of the nuances, and we are going to clean up the data and get the data standardized so that we can leverage it for, analytics, reporting, and now AI. So they implemented this framework called Anchored Agility. And I will tell you the big benefit in this approach was that they didn't implement it as just a decision framework. They made the choice that this should be culture, that they should be leveraging this for their culture and how they drive this after the program goes live. And so that was a nuance that really, really hit home. What did it lead to? Accelerated decision making. It led to a much more efficient design process. They were unified in their approach, and people felt empowered to challenge one another, not on emotion, not on this is the way I've always done it, but more on, okay, this is foundational. If it's foundational, why aren't we doing standard? Or since this is differentiating, we should spend time understanding how it differentiates us and which pieces so that we can focus and make sure we are doing that the best of anyone, anywhere in the world. So this created enhanced agility, efficiency in the program. This company went live this year very successfully to the point where they're able to take in an acquisition in 3 months and put them on the system because they removed most of the customization. They removed all of the nuances from different countries, and they really had a unified, clean platform. The last is the value-based quality assurance case study. This is one where our client had said they wanted QA, they wanted to do it in a traditional way, they wanted reports, they wanted the periodic review of documentation. This documentation, when you looked at it, often tells a story, but it's a very flat story, and it's very much of an after the fact. So we came in and we approached this and said, we would like to be more real time. We'd like to sit in meetings. We'd like to be in a position that we can offer recommendations to you and your leadership and to the team, right? Not going above the people doing the work, but really offer suggestions based on our experience to be able to help the team make better decisions and get out of groupthink, right? A lot of teams can get into groupthink where they all get into a mission. They think they've come up with the best solution. And yet nobody asks the simple question, something like, will it work? Will our people use it? Is this the best way to do it? Or what do other industries do? So by bringing that to the table, it helps to keep the team open. It helps to make sure that you don't get into groupthink and you get siloed and you get into, doing it the way you've always done it. There's always pushback that this can disrupt teams. But what we found is it's pretty minimally disruptive if we're a part of the team and we're able to do that. It also eliminates many of those issues that when you get into testing, you would have found. Things around usability, things around, the questions, why didn't we get the value? Why didn't we change? And if you're coming in late and you're evaluating the stuff when you get to testing, or even after design is finished, even if we have the best suggestions as a QA group and we look at it and say, hey, you should have done A, B, and C, here's how to do it. Oftentimes the next question is, but what's it going to cost to redo everything? And that's where the discussion ends. So by being involved early, it allows that to get in, that by the time you get to the final reviews, you're not getting these suggestions where, wish we had known this 6 months ago, but now we can't change. So these are 3 case studies. I can tell you, they're common in their focus around culture, decision-making, and quality that I see on most programs. And it's not to say that programs are doing it wrong. What we do find is that actually most programs do pretty well. And, you hear about the ones who don't, but the ones who go live successfully, except for in your hyper education period where you're looking for those successes, most clients don't appreciate how many of these can go well, and that the technology works and that the business can work. It really comes down to things that are more related to culture and around making decisions. I'm just looking over, I see. Okay, so I do see one question related to this stuff that I wanted to hit on, which is, what is the recommended approach for program culture and teaming when the teams are working offsite and onsite and in different time zones? That is a great question. We work, at least many of us work in a global world where we have offshore delivery, we have nearshore delivery, we have program teams that are in multiple time zones in the US, and where it's just no longer efficient or effective, cost effective to bring everybody to one large building together. What we find with that is that, we intentionally include, we have an offshore group in India, multiple, and we intentionally include them and plan our meetings during their times. And when we are doing team building activities, we extend that to India, we extend it to South America, we extend it throughout. We also find that co-location does not always mean in one location, that we can use co-location into multiple sites that the client may have. And sometimes there are sites. And then we look at it and say, then let's not focus on everybody being here every week. Let's focus on the whole team or large portions of the teams being here specific weeks and getting the most value out of those. The other part of that is that it is critical to think about those times when things like design, when making decisions, when kicking off testing or build, when it's more meaningful to have the team working in one location for a small period of time so that they can work out the kinks of how to work together, how to raise issues, how to ask questions. So it's a great question. It's not the easiest thing to handle, but I will tell you, if you spend some time planning it with your SI, with your other partners, there are many, many companies that make this work. So with that, before I go through some key takeaways, let me look through the questions. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. I'm going to look through and see what I've got. So there is one question about, can you elaborate on program culture versus company culture and why they need to be different? I love this question, and we get asked this a lot because the view is, hey, we have a great company culture. Our people love working here and they love working with each other. And so why can't we use that on the project? And there's a few facets. A corporate culture is meant for the corporation and the corporation to do well and for its people to work together. Problem is often programs and project culture needs to be about deadlines, about quick decision-making, around working with folks from different cultures, meaning in this case, corporate cultures, from your partners, from your groups. And so what we find is that when we try to take our corporate culture and impose it on the program, if we have a very hierarchical corporate culture that, executives make decisions, teams will have lots of meetings to build consensus, and then they approach the executives. It's too inefficient for a large S4 program. You can't wait weeks, months to make decisions. What you need is the trust of the team to make the decision. For those things they're empowered to make, and that's not saying everything. And then they present that out as, here are the series of decisions, here are the impacts, and here's what we would like to do, that can then be, I'll say, quote unquote, blessed by the executives. And then by putting in a solution board or other mindset where the solution boards are cross-functional, where you have business function or process folks, you have data folks, you have tech folks, you'll get a well-rounded set of decisions. And then when a decision needs to be made across solution boards is when you can impose an operating committee or others to help kind of break the tie when they don't agree on the solution. So while the corporate culture, and you need to understand your corporate culture, is important, it's more important to look at it in conjunction with the SIs you've selected and their culture, right? How are they incenting their people? How are they encouraging them to do work, and so forth? So I find that this is a common question, and it's one that a lot of folks look at and don't understand just how many cultures come together when you have 3 or 4 partners plus your own teams working together. Another question, you mentioned AI. What other areas are there to leverage AI on programs? So I mentioned it around quality and using it. We're seeing a lot of an uptick there of using AI in things like when you have all your program documentation and you're building it out and you have all your historical knowledge, that often resides on SharePoint or some other site. And it becomes very hard for new people joining to get information or to understand what's going on. We find that loading that all into chatbots and putting that information where people joining the project, people who've been on the project, leaders can ask questions of that bot, and things like, why did we make this decision? What is our decision on this? What's the history of this issue? And getting meaningful data quickly for them to be able to look at that information and get the experience. It also helps on onboarding. When new folks have lots of questions, they're able to ask and get answers based on the documentation and the information that has been built by what can be a very large team. Another area I mentioned was the QA part and the ability to look at that. We find that putting AI into the PMO and into the program side of this and leveraging it to look and proactively identify risks and issues, that takes it out of perhaps QA and puts it in the hands of the leadership team. And then I think the other part of this, if I step out of the program, SAP gives an awesome platform for the ability to use AI in the future. And now when you're doing the designs and you're thinking about it, you should be thinking about, what is the interaction going to be with our new platform, 3 years from now when we go live? It's not going to look like today. And so how can we leverage AI? How can we leverage the thought of not just doing our current jobs like reports and automating them, but actually being able to ask AI, like Jewel, questions about our business, about our operations, about our customers, where it's discerning the information from the data and from the data model, not just from prefabbed reports, which is what requires these programs to be very clean and rigid on decisions around quality of data, structure of data, standardization of processes, because all of those things make that easier and make it give you the ability. If you don't do those things, you'll get a platform that may work really well, but it gets increasingly harder to use tools like data and analytics and AI. And then let's see. So we have a question here, and I'll paraphrase. How do we identify if the vendor is trying to overstep responsibilities? And how do we ensure that people basically stay in their lane? I think, that's a great governance question. And it usually is a case where, in a positive way, are they stepping in because they see a gap and they're trying to fill it? Or, if it's the other side, is they're stepping in because they don't know where that boundary is, or they don't appreciate the boundary. Goes back to the culture. If you set up the culture, which always includes clear roles and responsibilities, clear ownership, RACI matrices, who owns what, how do we make decisions, then that gives you a place to really look at those And when you see someone, and I'll use a business example where we had a leader join the program, and that leader had their own culture. They joined about a year into the program, had a view that I solve problems. So whenever an issue or something was mentioned, like we're not sure how this is going to work, or we're looking for an alternative to this in a meeting, that person would go and try to solve it themselves. Problem with that is we had teams set up to do that who didn't appreciate that there was kind of this backwards or other meetings going on where this person was meeting with others in the program or with the business directly. Now, they were doing it for the right reasons in their head, right? They were just there to solve problems, move stuff forward, make decisions. What they didn't appreciate is that through the culture we had set up in the teams and the relationship, they were undermining the ability of that team. So it just took some simple redirection and getting that person to say, hey, we love this, great thoughts, great contributions, but here's the structure, and here were the cultural agreements we had to one another. And so could you help this team directly versus feeling like you need to solve this independently? And so by doing that and going back to those cultural agreements, which do need to be refreshed periodically because programs change and they morph, and who's making decisions during design could be different when we get to test. So I think there's often this view that can go negative that says, why is that person doing that? Why is that team not appreciating my role? I think usually those are parts of the culture and best addressed directly and best with a discussion of what are we trying to achieve? Why are we trying to achieve it? And then coming up with a joint solution. So I do have the last question I see here, and if you have any others, you can put them in the chat. The last question I see here is really about, with the business decision frameworks, how do they really reduce program cost? And I think I touched on this one briefly, but the big area around this one is going to be that if we take all of the designs and we think about what we need to build for an S4 solution that covers, finance and accounting, could cover work and asset, supply chain, procurement, HR, you name it, then in all of those areas, we are making decisions every day. And if we're not making them efficiently, we get very inefficient, higher cost programs. But if we can start the program off by saying, these are the 20% of those areas where we need to spend time and need to have the right amount of time to discuss and make decisions. We can also fast track others and put in the objectives and the guidelines that are around things like my friend journal entries, is we're not going to be unique in how we do journal entries. And if we have 5 ways to do it, we're going to 1, because there's no value in being different or in changing the way the system operates to do that. So what I find is that by doing this upfront and agreeing as a leadership team, tech, business, vendors, everybody, where those critical areas are, then you're going to front load those areas and hit them first in the program when you don't have the time pressure to just get done. You're going to bring the right people together when they're not fatigued, and you're going to spend the right amount of time in the areas you should. By doing that, you're going to reduce the overall cost of the program. You're also going to reduce the fact that those items get dropped later in the design process when you start to hit up on deadlines, when you start to go over schedule, and there becomes a focus on the burn rate. So using these things, setting them up, but getting a culture that agrees and buys in will be meaningful in what it saves the program. And when you're done, you will find that you will have less customization. You will have much higher business buy-in because they knew where they were going to focus. They were able to focus, and they were able to deliver the value that they intended. And the executives will appreciate the outcomes that the program is able to deliver. So with that, we'll start to wrap up and focus in on key takeaways. I think we spent a lot of time, and you'll notice I'm very passionate about program culture and how we team. I just find that, program culture in my world is the singular thing I can point to that will make a program successful or fail. And I find program success and why culture is so important is think back to any team you've worked on where you're like, wow, we really got stuff done. And I bet if you looked at that team and you thought about it, you would think about how well you work together. You would see things like trust, respect for one another, and you'd see how you all had an objective that of what you were going to achieve. You probably saw some issues you overcame using those tools. So program culture is critical. It's the hardest thing to get right, but when it works, and it does, it will be meaningful because it will help you through the decision process and the governance process, and it will help you to get everyone aligned around the values. So with that, just want to thank everyone for attending. I'd like to invite you. I'll be at Sapphire this year. We have a booth, 361. Come by, say hi. But also, if you have any follow-up questions, want to talk further, here's my contact information, and feel free to reach out. So have a great day, and thanks for joining today.
Hey, Todd, thanks so much for such a great webcast. That was really, really great. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. You will receive a post-event email tomorrow with the link to the on-demand version of this webcast. Please go ahead and share it. And please take that 2-question survey. It's going to pop up on your screen now. Have a great rest of your day.